Hey there, everybody, and welcome to this video on the 5 stages of trauma bond formation. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Snipes. If you are interested in working with people who have a history of trauma, a masterclass in trauma-informed care is available at allceus.com/TIC. Let's talk a little bit about what a trauma bond is before we start talking about how it's formed. A trauma bond is a connection between two or more people in which at least one person is a victim and the other person is an abuser. And the victim rationalizes or justifies the abuse. To survive what seems to be an inescapable situation, the victim begins to believe that the abuser's abuse shows that they love me. And they may start to believe that the abuse is their fault. If I were only better, I would not make them so angry. It's important to remember that trauma bonds are a common symptom of complex PTSD. Remember, in complex PTSD, there is a traumatic event that is repetitive or ongoing, and the victim perceives that there is no hope of escape. So it sounds a lot like what happens when a trauma bond is formed. What are the stages of trauma bond formation? And it's important to think about these stages because if you recognize them early, then you can potentially leave a relationship before it becomes oppressive, before you start feeling completely powerless to leave. So the first stage in a trauma bond often is the honeymoon or the love bombing stage. Now, trauma bonds can occur between couples, if you will. They can occur between parent and child. They can occur between employer and employee, specifically in trafficking situations. And there are probably other circumstances, but we're going to talk about those 3. So in a dating relationship, for example, there's the honeymoon phase and the love bombing where the abuser is just showering the person with compliments and gifts and love. And the victim is feeling so wonderful, so awesome, and they don't want this feeling to ever end. Once the abuser has the person kind of addicted to feeling that way, then they start moving to make the victim dependent on them. And that can be moving them in. So now they don't have a place of their own, so they can't escape quite as easily. Maybe starting to control their finances. Maybe starting to encourage them to make decisions in which they are trusting of the abuser. And sometimes these are going to have positive consequences because at this point, the abuser hasn't moved into the controlling phase. At this point, it's not love bombing anymore, but the abuser is still laying that groundwork. Once the person is to a point that they trust the abuser, then the abuser moves into isolating them. They start demanding all of that person's time. They start being much more concerned about where the person goes. The abuser does not want the victim to have support anywhere else. The abuser does not want the victim to feel like they have any route of escape. The abuser does not want the victim to encounter anyone that might undo the narrative that they are getting ready to start spinning. Then they move into criticism and gaslighting. They start to blame the victim when things go wrong and manipulate them into believing their narrative. Anything that goes wrong, it's your fault. I want to love you. I want to shower you with love and with gifts the way we did when we first got together, but you just keep screwing up. And how is anybody supposed to love you when you screw up all the time? So the abuser is now breaking down the self-esteem of the victim, making them feel unlovable and incompetent and incapable. So the victim starts to feel even more dependent, even more reliant on the abuser, because they start thinking, well, if I'm this much of a screw up, there's no way anybody else wants me. There's no way I can survive on my own. So now the abuser has control. The victim doesn't know what to believe, and the only way they can feel safe and loved is to appease the abuser. Remember, at this point, they've been isolated from their family, and the abuser has probably turned them against their family through gaslighting. And the only person the victim has at this point that they believe actually loves them is the abuser. And the victim does believe that the abuser loves them. That is one of the things that's so nefarious about a trauma bond, is that eventually the victim gets to the place where, in order to survive this, they have to see it in a way that makes sense to them. So let's talk about a couple different situations. Honeymoon and love bombing. We talked about relationships. They get together, they're showered with attention, with praise. Then trust and dependency. The abuser moves the person in. Maybe they start a joint bank account. And then isolation. The abuser starts saying, no, you know what? I don't think we're going to go to your families for vacation or for the holidays. We're going to go to my families, or we're going to stay here. I have to work, so why don't we just stay here? And they start creating wedges between the victim and the victim's family and the victim's friends, so they become more isolated. Many times, the abuser will also go so far as to have the victim start staying home completely, not going to work, where they might get alternate input from other people. This doesn't always happen, but they make sure, the abuser makes sure to engage in sufficient gaslighting that the victim is going to defend the abuser to their coworkers. You wouldn't understand. He's under so much stress. It's not his fault or her fault, etc. Then the criticism and gaslighting, as I mentioned, is blaming the victim when things go wrong and manipulating them into believing their narrative. So let's look at how this might go in a employer-employee situation. And this can be between someone and their pimp, or an employer who brings in somebody from another country, for example, to work for them. The employee comes in, and in the case of the pimp, the employee may be already alienated from their family to a certain extent, so they're vulnerable. And the pimp comes in and starts showering them with attention, with love, with drugs, with whatever they need, starts creating that dependency. In the case of someone who comes in on a visa, or as an illegal, the person is now separated from their family, from their culture, from their friends, and they have no way to get back home if the new employers become abusive. So now they're kind of stuck. And especially if they are illegal, then they don't feel like they have any recourse, which they actually do, but they are led to believe that they will be arrested and sent to prison if they report any of the abuse. Then comes the criticism and the gaslighting and the control of the victim. If the videos on this channel have been helpful for you, please help us make high-quality, practical content available to everyone. Donate at docsnipes.com/donate. Join the channel at docsnipes.com/join. Or purchase a thanks on any video that you particularly like. Trauma bonds can be formed between parents and children, where the parents are the abusers and the children recognize they can't survive on their own. But it can also go the other way. And I see this more often in adult children who are unable to live independently or choose not to live independently, where they still live in the household and become abusive of their parents, or in adult children who end up needing to take care of their elderly parent and they begin abusing their elderly parent. It can happen between employers and employees in trafficking situations. It can happen between adult partners, and it can happen between captors and victims, which is the standard Stockholm syndrome that we studied probably in Psychology 101. Trauma bond development is a very intentional behavior. Make no mistake, the abuser knows what they're doing. And the abuser can often be diagnosed with either narcissistic or antisocial personality disorder because they're engaging in this behavior with the intent of controlling another person for their own gain. It is not an accidental thing that happens. There's a definite grooming process that the individual uses in order to create this trauma bond. And trauma bonds, because of their very nature, because the victim has come to believe that they are completely dependent on the abuser, they can't survive without the abuser, and they can't survive if they leave the abuser might hurt them. They have to try to figure out how to make this make sense in their own mind. So they start believing that it's them. They start believing that the abuser does love them and it's their fault that they are getting abused. This makes the trauma bond so hard to break from a third-party perspective. The victim needs to come to the realization, needs to come to the awareness that it's an unhealthy relationship. And that involves a lot of deprogramming, if you will. Awareness of the trauma bonding process is the first step in preventing it. If you see the love bombing, okay, well, sometimes love bombing happens just out of sheer, new relationship energy. But then if it moves into trust and dependency, then isolation, those are huge red warning flags that people need to be aware of and get out before the gaslighting and the controlling begins. This obviously was just a video that was designed to help people understand a little bit more about what a trauma bond is. In the upcoming videos, we'll talk about ways to potentially support people who have a trauma bond and ways to break a trauma bond.